Ancient sages believed that thoughts were not passive events trapped inside the skull. They taught that every thought carried a form of energy, every emotion possessed a vibration, and every repeated mental pattern acted like a silent force secretly shaping your entire reality. Thousands of years before modern science began exploring the nature of energy, mystery schools in Egypt and Hermetic teachers across the ancient world spoke of invisible laws governing reality itself. They claimed that nothing in the universe is truly at rest. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. Everything influences everything else, the most astonishing part. They believed that human consciousness was not separate from these laws. It participated in them. Ancient priests guarded it within temple walls. Philosophers hinted at it through symbols. Mystics devoted lifetimes trying to understand it. Yet today, most people remain completely unaware of its existence. Consider this. Two people can walk through the same storm and emerge with entirely different futures. Two people can experience the same setback, the same loss, the same opportunity, and create radically different outcomes. Why? The ancients believed the answer was hidden in a law that governs all things, a law operating beneath appearances, a law of energy, vibration, and frequency. And whether you understand it or not, it is shaping your reality every single day. Nothing escapes it, not your relationships, not your health, not your opportunities. Not even the story you tell yourself about who you are. The question is not whether this law affects your life. The question is whether you are consciously working with it or unconsciously working against it. In the next few moments, we will journey through some of humanity's oldest and most fascinating teachings. You will discover why the Hermetic sages declared that everything in existence is vibration. Why Marcus Aurelius believed that a person's inner world determines the quality of their outer experience. Why Plato taught that visible reality is only a shadow of something deeper. Why ancient Egyptian initiates spent years learning to master consciousness before they were entrusted with sacred knowledge. And why Carl Jung became convinced that unseen patterns connect events in ways most people never notice. But perhaps the most surprising discovery is this: the secret was never about controlling the world around you. It was about understanding the invisible forces operating within you, because according to some of history's greatest wisdom traditions, the reality you experience is not merely something that happens to you. It is something you participate in shaping every day. And by the end of this journey, you may never look at your thoughts, emotions, or circumstances in quite the same way again. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Hermetic Secret. There is an ancient story whispered through centuries of mystery schools, hidden libraries, and forgotten temples. It tells of a figure known as Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a sage said to embody both Egyptian and Greek wisdom. Whether he was one man, many teachers, or a symbolic representation of ancient knowledge remains uncertain. Yet the teachings attributed to him survived empires, crossed continents, and influenced philosophers, alchemists, mystics, and seekers for thousands of years. What made these teachings so powerful was not that they promised secret powers. It was that they claimed reality itself operated according to hidden laws that most people never notice. The ancients believed that human beings suffer not because reality is cruel, but because they remain unaware of the principles governing their experience. Like a sailor drifting without knowledge of wind or tide, many move through life, reacting to circumstances, without understanding the forces beneath them. Hermetic wisdom begins with a startling possibility. There is more occurring beneath appearances than the eye can see. An old Hermetic parable tells of a young student who traveled across deserts seeking wisdom. After years of searching, he finally reached a temple where a revered teacher lived. The student expected secret rituals and hidden scrolls. Instead, the teacher handed him a mirror. Confused, the student asked, "Where is the wisdom?" The teacher replied, "The wisdom is learning why you cannot stop looking away." At first, the student thought the answer was meaningless, but over time he discovered something profound. Every fear, desire, judgment, resentment, and hope he carried influenced how he interpreted the world around him. He was not merely seeing reality, he was participating in its construction through perception. The lesson was simple. The greatest mystery was not the universe. The greatest mystery was consciousness itself. Hermetic texts such as the Corpus Hermeticum repeatedly return to this theme. They describe reality not as a collection of separate objects, but as a living, interconnected whole infused with intelligence. Human consciousness is portrayed not as an accidental byproduct of existence, but as a participant within a greater cosmic order. This idea appears strange to modern ears, yet its psychological depth remains remarkable. Consider two people walking through the same storm. One sees inconvenience, frustration, and misfortune. The other sees beauty, renewal, and necessary rain. The external event is identical. The internal experience is entirely different. What changed? Awareness. The Hermetic masters understood that while circumstances matter, consciousness determines how those circumstances are experienced. They were less interested in controlling the world than in understanding the relationship between observer and observed. A farmer in ancient Egypt once complained endlessly about the flooding of the Nile. Each season he cursed the waters, seeing only destruction and inconvenience. His neighbor welcomed the flood. He understood that the same waters bringing temporary hardship would later nourish the fields and sustain life. One man experienced suffering, the other experienced opportunity. The river remained unchanged. The difference existed within the observer. Such stories reveal a central Hermetic insight. Reality is not merely encountered. It is interpreted, and interpretation shapes experience. This does not mean that difficult events are imaginary. Hermetic wisdom never suggested ignoring reality. Rather, it taught that awareness determines whether hardship becomes imprisonment or transformation. Many people spend years fighting circumstances while neglecting the condition of their own minds. They attempt to rearrange the outer world while remaining strangers to the inner one. The ancient initiates considered this backwards. They believed that lasting transformation begins with understanding the forces operating within consciousness itself. Notice your thoughts. Notice your reactions. Notice the stories you tell yourself. These hidden patterns quietly influence every decision, every relationship, and every opportunity you encounter. What you repeatedly notice expands. What you repeatedly ignore fades. This is not magic. It is awareness. The forgotten Hermetic secret is not that reality bends to human wishes. It is that human beings participate in reality far more deeply than they realize. The universe, according to Hermetic thought, is not a machine indifferent to consciousness. It is a living process in which awareness plays a meaningful role. This realization changes everything. The victim becomes a participant. The observer becomes a creator. The seeker becomes a student of consciousness itself. And from that moment forward, life is no longer something merely happening to you. It becomes something you consciously engage. Reality responds to awareness. Chapter 2. Marcus Aurelius and the Color of Thought. Centuries after Hermes, another man sat beneath a very different sky. He was not a temple initiate. He was not an alchemist. He was not a mystic hidden in the desert. He was the most powerful man in the known world. His name was Marcus Aurelius. As Emperor of Rome, he commanded armies, governed vast territories, and carried responsibilities beyond what most people could imagine. Yet despite possessing immense external power, Marcus devoted his life to mastering something far more difficult, his own mind. In his private writings, later known as Meditations, Marcus recorded a sentence that continues to echo through history. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. At first glance, the statement appears simple, but hidden within it is an entire philosophy of human transformation. Marcus understood that thoughts are not fleeting visitors, they are sculptors. Each repeated thought leaves an imprint. Each habitual perspective shapes perception. Each emotional pattern influences character. Over time, the mind becomes what it repeatedly entertains. An old Stoic story tells of two merchants traveling the same road. Both encountered thieves and lost much of their wealth. The first merchant spent years consumed by bitterness. He replayed the event endlessly, growing suspicious of everyone he met. His distrust poisoned friendships, business partnerships, and opportunities. The second merchant also felt pain. But after mourning his loss, he chose a different path. He treated the experience as a lesson in resilience and wisdom. Years later, the first man remained imprisoned by the event. The second had transformed because of it. The same circumstance produced two different destinies. The difference was not fate. It was interpretation. Marcus Aurelius saw this principle everywhere. He observed that human beings often suffer twice, first from events, then from the stories they create about those events. A setback becomes proof of failure, a criticism becomes proof of inadequacy, a mistake becomes proof of worthlessness. Yet these meanings are rarely inherent in the events themselves. They are constructed by the mind. Modern psychology increasingly confirms what the Stoics understood centuries ago. The narratives people tell themselves profoundly influence behavior, emotional health, confidence, relationships, and resilience. The story becomes the lens becomes the experience. Imagine a woman who believes she is incapable of success. Every challenge appears threatening. Every setback confirms her assumption. Every achievement feels temporary. Her belief silently organizes perception. Now imagine another person facing identical circumstances while believing growth is possible. The challenges remain difficult. The obstacles remain real, yet the interpretation changes. And with it, behavior changes. Results begin changing as well. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that external events were often beyond his control, but his response remained his responsibility. This distinction became one of Stoicism's greatest teachings: control what is yours, resh what is not. Many people exhaust themselves trying to govern circumstances while neglecting their reactions. The Stoics reversed the equation. They focused inward first, not because the outer world lacked importance, but because inner mastery created stability regardless of external conditions. A tree survives storms not because the wind disappears, but because its roots run deep. The same principle applies to human beings. Mental discipline is not the suppression of emotion. It is the cultivation of awareness. It is learning to observe fear without obeying it, observe anger without becoming it, observe doubt without surrendering to it. Marcus practiced this daily, even as emperor. He reminded himself that no title could protect him from negative thinking. Wealth could not substitute for wisdom. Power could not replace self-knowledge. The true battle was always internal. And that battle continues today. Every morning, countless people wake and immediately begin rehearsing worries, resentments, fears, and imagined failures. They unknowingly color their perception before the day even begins. Then they wonder why life feels heavy. The ancient Stoics would have understood. The mind becomes what it repeatedly practices. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Fortunately, the reverse is also true. Gratitude strengthens gratitude. Courage strengthens courage. Patience strengthens patience. Awareness strengthens awareness. Every thought is a brushstroke. Every day adds color. Every habit contributes to character. The question is not whether your thoughts shape you. They do. The question is what kind of person they are shaping. Marcus Aurelius left behind no secret rituals, no hidden treasure maps, and no magical formulas. He left something far more valuable. A reminder that freedom begins with mastery of perception, because in the end, destiny is not built solely through actions. It is built through the thoughts that repeatedly guide those actions. Thought becomes character. Chapter 3. Plato and the Invisible Dimension. There is a moment in Plato's account of reality that feels less like philosophy and more like a warning whispered through time. A group of prisoners sit chained inside a dark cavern. Their entire existence is built on shadows projected against a wall. They have never turned around, never questioned the origin of what they see. To them, the flickering silhouettes are not symbols, they are life itself. Plato did not describe this as fiction. He described it as condition. In the allegory of the cave, reality is split into two layers, what is seen and what is true. The visible world is not false, but incomplete. It is a fragment of something deeper, like watching ripples on a lake and believing you understand the ocean beneath it. Ancient philosophers across traditions echoed the same unsettling idea. Humans do not experience reality directly. They experience interpretation. A Stoic would call it perception. A Hermetic would call it vibration. Plato called it shadow, and in all cases the message remains the same. What you see is never the whole structure. Plato describes what happens when one prisoner is freed. At first, he is not enlightened. He is overwhelmed. The fire behind him hurts his eyes. The objects casting shadows feel alien and unstable. The world he trusted begins to dissolve. Even the idea of truth becomes uncomfortable. And when he finally exits the cave, the sunlight blinds him. He resists it, because truth, when first encountered, does not feel like freedom. It feels like loss. This is a pattern repeated in human psychology even today. When someone outgrows an old belief, identity, or worldview, they do not immediately feel expanded. They feel disoriented. The mind clings to shadows because shadows are familiar. Comfort often disguises itself as truth. The deeper interpretation of Plato's teaching was never about physical imprisonment. It was about cognitive imprisonment. The cave is the conditioned mind. The shadows are assumptions. This is who I am. This is how the world works. This is what I can or cannot become. Modern psychology would later echo this through cognitive bias, learned helplessness, and identity conditioning. Ancient wisdom simply expressed it in symbolic language. Every human being, Plato suggests, carries a private cave inside them, and most never turn around, not because they cannot, but because questioning the cave is destabilizing. Plato's second claim is more radical. Beyond the visible world exists a higher structure of reality, not necessarily supernatural, but foundational. The visible world is shaped by invisible principles. Beliefs shape perception. Perception shapes action. Action shapes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce belief. What looks like external reality is often internal architecture projected outward. A man who believes he is incapable will interpret neutral events as failure. A person who believes life is hostile will find evidence everywhere to confirm it, not because reality changes, but because interpretation does. This is the invisible dimension Plato pointed toward, the realm of meaning beneath matter. Plato adds another detail often overlooked. The prisoner who returns to the cave is not welcomed. He is ridiculed, rejected, sometimes even attacked. Why? Because he now sees differently, and that threatens the shared illusion others rely on for stability. This is not only philosophy, it is human behavior. When someone shifts perspective, they disrupt collective agreement, and systems built on agreement resist contradiction. Truth does not always create harmony. Sometimes it creates separation before clarity. Plato's teaching does not end in abstraction. It becomes psychological instruction. To leave the cave means question what you assume is fixed. Observe what beliefs shape your interpretation. Separate experience from interpretation. Recognize that meaning is often added, not found. A person practicing this begins to notice something subtle. The same event can create entirely different realities depending on perception. Failure becomes instruction. Rejection becomes redirection. Uncertainty becomes transition. Nothing changes externally, but everything changes internally, and that shift is the first step out of the cave. There is a story preserved in later philosophical tradition of a young student who studied under a strict teacher in Athens. The teacher would ask only one question for months. What are you seeing? At first, the student described objects, then emotions, then memories attached to those objects. Eventually he realized something unsettling. He was never describing reality itself, only his reaction to it. One day, the teacher said nothing. He simply pointed at a tree outside. The student hesitated. For the first time he could not decide what he was seeing. Was it a tree or his interpretation of a tree? That hesitation was the beginning of philosophical awakening. Plato's warning is not that reality is false. It is that certainty about reality is often premature. The mind confuses familiarity with truth. But familiarity is just repetition, and repetition can exist entirely inside illusion. Chapter 4. The Ancient Egyptian Secret of Conscious Creation. Long before philosophy was written in Greece, another understanding of reality was carved into temple walls along the Nile. In ancient Egypt, reality was not seen as static matter. It was seen as a living field of divine intelligence, responsive, symbolic, and deeply interactive. Creation, they believed, did not end in the past. It continued through consciousness. Within certain Egyptian temples, initiation rituals were not merely symbolic ceremonies. They were psychological reprogramming systems, encoded in myth, sound, and ritual movement. Priests did not perform reality, they participated in it. Sacred speech, or haiku, was believed to carry creative force. Words were not descriptions of reality, they were instruments that shaped it. To speak was to direct energy, to name was to define, to focus was to activate. This reflects a core ancient belief. Consciousness does not observe reality passively, it interacts with it. Egyptian cosmology begins not with matter, but with thought. Before the pyramids, before the Nile civilization, there was none. The primordial field of potential. From this formless expanse emerged creation through divine imagination. The gods did not build reality as engineers build structures, they imagined it into existence. And in symbolic teaching, humans were not separate from this process, they were reflections of it. A mind capable of imagination was considered a fragment of divine function, not metaphorically, but structurally. Ancient Egyptian priests understood something psychology would only rediscover thousands of years later. Language shapes perception. The way a person speaks internally constructs emotional reality. A mind that says, "I always fail," creates repetition. A mind that says, "I am trapped," creates limitation. A mind that says, "Nothing changes," creates stagnation. But sacred speech was the opposite, naming order into chaos, directing attention toward possibility, reframing experience into meaning. Words were seen as spells not because they were magical, but because they reprogram perception. Modern neuroscience echoes this. Repeated language strengthens neural pathways, shaping behavior over time. The ancients encoded this truth in ritual form. One of the most symbolic practices involved priests entering inner sanctums and engaging in structured visualization. They would stand in silence, focus attention on symbolic objects, recite spoken formulas. Imagine divine alignment between heaven and earth. To outsiders, it appeared ritualistic, but internally, it trained consciousness to hold specific states of awareness. The goal was not worship alone, it was alignment. A mind aligned with order was believed to influence reality itself, not by force, but by resonance. In Egyptian thought, attention was not passive observation. It was selection. What is observed becomes emphasized. What is emphasized becomes reinforced. What is reinforced becomes reality. This is why initiates trained their attention carefully. To them, scattered attention meant scattered creation. Modern psychology now describes this as attentional bias. What we focus on becomes our perceived world. Ancient Egyptians simply called it participation in creation. There is an inscription attributed to Hermetic Egyptian tradition that reflects this idea. The world is a mirror of the soul, and the soul is shaped by what it beholds. Whether literal or symbolic, the message remains consistent. Consciousness is not separate from creation. It is part of its ongoing process. To shift awareness is to shift participation. Chapter 5. Why repetition programs reality. There is an ancient principle that every mystery school understood long before science gave it a name. What repeats becomes reality, not as poetry, as structure. In the temples of Egypt, initiates did not begin with secret knowledge. They began with repetition. Sacred phrases spoken at dawn. Ritual movements repeated until the body no longer questioned them. Symbols drawn again and again until the mind stopped seeing them as objects and began seeing them as truth. They knew something modern psychology is only rediscovering. The mind does not obey what it hears once. It obeys what it hears repeatedly. A man may hear he is capable once and forget it by evening, but if he repeats that belief daily, if he acts it, speaks it, reinforces it, the mind slowly begins to reorganize itself around that identity. One hermetic fragment describes the human being as a woven pattern of impressions. In modern language, we might call this habit loops, neural pathways, conditioned responses. But the ancients would simply say, "You are what you continuously return to." In a small village near the old trade routes of the East, there is an old story told of a potter who shaped clay every day for 50 years. A traveler once asked him what made his vessels so perfect. The potter did not speak of talent. He spoke of repetition. "I do not make pots," he said. "I return to the wheel. Every morning, same motion, same pressure, same rhythm." And slowly, over time, his hands no longer decided. They knew. His craft became invisible. This is how reality shapes the human mind as well. Your thoughts are not random visitors. They are returning patterns. and what returns often enough begins to feel like identity. A Stoic would say, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But we can go deeper. The soul is dyed not by a single thought, but by the thoughts it repeats without resistance. Before modern productivity systems, there were rituals. Rituals were not superstition. They were behavioral programming disguised as sacred meaning. Morning prayers, repeated gestures, chants, fasting cycles. These were not only spiritual practices. They were psychological conditioning tools. They trained the mind to enter specific states on command. A monk repeating a mantra for years is not trying to convince a deity. He is reshaping his inner landscape until certain thoughts lose power and others become natural. Modern life still operates on rituals, but unconscious ones. Checking your phone before thinking, replaying doubts before sleep, rehearsing fear before action, repeating internal criticism without noticing. The difference is simple. Ancient rituals were chosen. Modern rituals are inherited. And what is inherited without awareness becomes destiny without resistance. There is a moment in every life that goes unnoticed. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not remembered. It is the moment a repeated thought becomes unquestioned. I am not good enough. I always fail. Nothing changes. The first time it is just a thought. The 100th time it becomes a lens. The 1000th time it becomes identity. And identity is the most powerful repetition of all. Because once identity forms, it begins selecting experiences that confirm itself. This is why change often feels impossible, not because reality is fixed, but because repetition has already decided what feels real. In forgotten Hermetic schools, students were sometimes given a strange instruction. Interrupt the pattern before it becomes prophecy. They were not told to fight reality. They were told to observe repetition at its earliest stage. Because the true power is not in reacting to outcomes, it is in noticing the first return of a thought before it becomes a cycle. Pause before repetition, interrupt before identity forms, choose before automation begins. That is where freedom exists. Chapter 6. Carl Jung and the invisible patterns behind events. There is a point where repetition moves beyond the personal, where life begins to feel symbolic, where events seem connected not by logic but by meaning. This is where Carl Jung entered dangerous intellectual territory. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by cause and effect alone, but feel deeply connected through significance. To the rational mind, this is dismissed as randomness. To the symbolic mind, it is language. Jung once treated a patient who was deeply intellectual, highly skeptical, and emotionally rigid. She resisted every interpretation of unconscious meaning. Everything, to her, was mechanical. During a session, she described a dream of a golden scarab beetle, a symbol of rebirth in ancient Egyptian mythology. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. A faint tapping came from the window. Jung opened it. A real beetle entered the room, an uncommon scarabæifed species, rare in that region and entirely unexpected at that moment. He caught it and placed it on the table and said, "Here is your scarab." The patient broke. Something in her rigid worldview cracked open, not because of superstition, but because meaning had collided with matter in a way that could not be ignored. Ancient Egyptian priests would not have been surprised. To them, reality was layered. One layer of physical cause, one layer of symbolic correspondence, one layer of unseen intelligence. Events were not isolated. They were echoes within a larger pattern. Jung suggested something similar, that beneath the conscious mind exists a vast shared field of imagery and archetypes, the collective unconscious. In this field, human experiences are not random. They are structured, they resonate, which is why certain events feel timed, even when no visible cause connects them. There is a dangerous misunderstanding about synchronicity. It is not that the universe magically arranges external events for you. It is that your mind is constantly organizing perception around internal patterns, and reality reflects what is already being prioritized in awareness. A person obsessed with fear will notice fear everywhere. A person attuned to opportunity will see openings others miss. A person engaged in inner transformation will encounter external catalysts that mirror that process. Not because the world changes, but because perception filters differently. The Hermetic principle whispers here again. The observer and the observed are not separate. Mystery schools warned initiates of something subtle. The greatest illusion is not ignorance, it is unrecognized pattern, because when patterns are unseen, they control behavior silently. A man who does not recognize his repeating choices believes he is deciding freely, when he is actually replaying encoded cycles. Jung called this the unconscious at work. Hermeticism called it the hidden architecture of mind. Modern psychology calls it implicit conditioning. Different languages. Same truth. There comes a stage in awareness where life stops appearing purely mechanical, not because reality changes, but because interpretation deepens. A repeated encounter, a recurring number, a symbolic dream that mirrors waking events, a conversation that echoes an internal conflict you have not voiced. These moments are not necessarily supernatural. They are pattern intersections where internal states and external events align in meaning. The mistake is to either over-mystify everything or deny meaning entirely. The Hermetic path walks between both extremes. Observe patterns, do not worship them, do not dismiss them, learn from them. Jung's deepest insight was not that coincidences are mystical, it was that meaning is not added to experience, it is revealed through awareness. The mind is not passive, it is interpretive, and what it repeatedly interprets, it begins to live. This is where synchronicity becomes personal responsibility. What patterns are you unconsciously participating in? What meaning are you repeatedly reinforcing? What symbols are you ignoring because they disrupt comfort? Because in the end, synchronicity is not about prediction, it is about recognition. Chapter 7. The frequency of gratitude. There was a time when wisdom was not written in books, but carried in breath, in silence, in the way a person looked at the world before speaking. Among the early contemplatives, Stoic thinkers, desert monks, and wandering healers, there existed a strange understanding. Gratitude was not an emotion, but a frequency, a state of alignment that changed what reality revealed. The ancients observed something unsettling about human perception. Two people could stand under the same sky, one seeing scarcity, the other seeing abundance. One would notice what is missing, the other what is already present. They concluded that reality itself did not change first. The observer did. In Stoic circles, Marcus Aurelius wrote in fragments meant for himself alone. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. What he meant was simple but severe. Your repeated inner tone becomes your lived experience. If your thoughts repeat lack, life begins to feel like lack. If your thoughts repeat presence, even difficulty begins to soften. But long before Stoicism, desert traditions told a quieter story. In the eastern deserts, where silence stretches like an endless ocean, there is a story of a monk who owned almost nothing. No possessions worth naming, no reputation, no comfort beyond what the earth provided. Visitors who passed through his small dwelling would often ask him, How do you endure such emptiness?" The monk would always smile. One day a traveler, tired, bitter, carrying the weight of failure, decided to stay with him for several days. He expected to witness suffering, deprivation, maybe even despair. Instead, he witnessed something strange. Each morning the monk would sit outside his shelter and quietly observe the rising sun as if it were a personal gift. He would drink water as if it had been drawn from a sacred spring. He would thank the wind for passing through the valley. On the third day, the traveler finally asked, "What are you grateful for?" "You have nothing." The monk looked at him for a long moment and said, "That is why I am grateful." The traveler did not understand at first. But later that night, sitting alone, he realized something disturbing. He had everything he once prayed for: food, shelter, safety, yet felt hollow. The monk had nothing external, yet felt full. The difference was not possession, it was perception. Gratitude had not changed the monk's circumstances. It had changed what his circumstances meant. That is the hidden mechanism ancient wisdom pointed toward. Meaning is the first layer of reality. Modern psychology, without using mystical language, arrived at a similar observation. The mind tends to amplify what it repeatedly focuses on. Attention becomes structure. Structure becomes identity. When a person repeatedly scans life for what is wrong, the brain strengthens pathways of threat detection. Over time, even neutral events begin to feel like problems. But when attention is repeatedly directed toward what is present, stable, and already functioning, the nervous system begins to settle. The world does not change instantly, but interpretation does. Ancient teachers would have called this inner tuning. They believed gratitude was not denial of suffering. It was resistance to distortion, a refusal to let absence define the whole of existence. There is a subtle distinction here. Gratitude is not pretending life is perfect. It is remembering life is not only what is broken. In old trading cities, merchants would often compete not only with goods, but with attitude. A well-known parable tells of two vendors selling identical grain in the same market. The first vendor complained constantly about weather, taxes, competition, and exhaustion. His stall was always tense, his voice sharp, his presence heavy. The second vendor greeted every customer with calm appreciation. He did not exaggerate happiness. He simply treated each interaction as meaningful. Over time, customers gravitated toward the second vendor, not because his grain was different, but because his presence changed how people felt while buying it. One observer asked an elder why this happened. The elder replied, "People do not only buy grain, they buy the feeling of being alive while they do it." Gratitude in this sense is not passive thankfulness. It is energetic presence that alters perception itself. Gratitude begins to reveal its true function, not during celebration, but during repetition, the morning cup of water. The same road walked daily, the familiar face of a family member. These are the places where perception either collapses into boredom or expands into recognition. Ancient wisdom suggested a radical idea. Nothing becomes ordinary unless the mind stops participating in it. The monk in the desert did not have more life than the traveler. He had more awareness inside the same life. That is the real teaching behind gratitude frequency. It is not about adding experiences. It is about restoring depth to existing ones. Chapter 8, Native Wisdom and the Web of Connection. Long before philosophy became written argument, it was lived observation. Among indigenous cultures across continents, far apart yet strangely aligned, there existed a shared understanding. Nothing exists alone, not thought, not action, not life itself. The forest was not seen as a collection of trees, but as a single breathing intelligence. The river was not water moving downhill, but a memory carrying itself forward. Human beings were not separate observers of nature. They were participants inside it. This was not metaphor. It was perception. In one remembered tradition, elders would gather their community around a fire at night. No one interrupted the elder while he spoke, not because of authority, but because silence was considered part of understanding. One night, a young listener asked, "Where does a person end and the world begin?" The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed a burning stick into the fire until it glowed brighter, then removed it and held it up. He said, "Is this stick separate from the fire?" The youth replied, "It was in the fire, now it is not." The elder nodded. "But what made it glow?" The youth hesitated. "The fire is not only where it is," the elder said, "it is also what it touches." Then he pointed toward the group. "So tell me again, where does a person end?" No one answered, because they understood the implication. Separation was useful for survival, but incomplete for truth. Modern understanding of psychology and systems thinking echoes this ancient intuition. Human emotions are not isolated events. They ripple through environments. A tense person changes the tone of a room. A calm presence stabilizes it. A fearful mind spreads interpretation patterns to others without speaking. Ancient cultures called this spiritual influence. Today, it might be described as emotional contagion or cognitive synchronization, but the core insight remains unchanged. Inner state is not private, it participates. This is why elders emphasized responsibility, not just for actions, but for states of being, because states of being shape the invisible architecture of interaction. Indigenous wisdom often used nature itself as instructor. A tree does not compete with the forest, it contributes to it. When one tree weakens, others adjust in subtle ways. Root networks shift, light exposure changes. Nutrients redistribute. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is ecological cooperation. Ancient observers saw this and drew a direct conclusion about human life. Isolation is not the natural state of intelligence. It is fragmentation. A person disconnected from others is not more free. They are less integrated into the system of life. There is a story told of a young hunter who believed strength meant independence. He avoided community, believing reliance weakened him. One season he traveled deeper into the wilderness than anyone before him. At first, he felt powerful, self-sufficient, untethered, but as time passed, something shifted. His food became harder to find. His judgment grew clouded. His awareness of danger narrowed. He began to feel the forest differently, not as ally but as opposition. One night, injured and exhausted, he encountered an elder who lived near the river. The elder did not question his pride. He simply fed him and tended to his wounds. When the hunter recovered, he asked, "How do you survive here alone?" The elder responded, "I am not alone." "I listen," the hunter asked. "Listen to what?" The elder gestured to the river, the wind, the insects, the distant movement of animals. Everything speaks, not in words, in patterns. The hunter realized then that his mistake was not physical isolation, it was perceptual isolation. He had stopped participating in the web. Native wisdom consistently returns to one principle. Existence is relational. What you do affects what surrounds you. What surrounds you shapes what you become. This is not mystical abstraction, it is lived reality. Relationships are not external to identity, they are part of it. Environment is not background, it is co-author. When a person forgets this, life feels fragmented. When they remember it, life becomes coherent again. Chapter 9. The Principle of Mentalism. There was a teaching whispered only inside the oldest hermetic circles, preserved not in stone alone, but in silence passed from teacher to disciple. It said that reality is not something you enter, but something you interpret through awareness. Hermetic texts call it mentalism, the principle that the all is mind, not a human mind, not a personal imagination, but a universal intelligence, an underlying field of consciousness in which all experience arises. To understand this, imagine an ancient scribe in Alexandria, sitting under flickering oil light. He is not merely writing history, he believes he is participating in it. Every word he writes is an act of shaping meaning, not just recording events. In his worldview, the ink is not passive. It is alive with interpretation. Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary teacher behind these ideas, was described not as a man alone, but as a symbol of awakened consciousness, half human, half divine awareness. In the Corpus Hermeticum, he speaks to students who ask the oldest question, "What is real?" His answer is always unsettlingly simple: reality is what consciousness agrees to experience. This is not saying the external world does not exist. Rather, it suggests that what you call external is always filtered through perception. Two people can stand in the same storm. One sees destruction, the other renewal. The storm is identical, the mind is not. Ancient Stoics echoed this without using Hermetic language. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul is dyed by its thoughts. What he meant was not poetic exaggeration, but psychological observation. If you repeat fear, the world becomes threatening. If you repeat clarity, the world becomes navigable. The outside rarely changes first. The interpretation does. A young initiate in a mystery school once asked his teacher, "If everything is mind, does that mean I create everything that happens to me?" The teacher smiled and placed a bowl of water before him. "Look into it." The initiate saw his reflection. The teacher then disturbed the water. The reflection shattered into fragments. "Did you create the reflection?" the teacher asked. "Yes," the initiate replied. "And did you create the ripples?" Silence followed. The lesson was not about control, but participation. Mentalism does not claim absolute personal control over events. It points to the deeper truth that consciousness shapes meaning, and meaning shapes response, and response shapes life. Modern psychology unknowingly echoes this principle. Cognitive science shows that beliefs filter perception. What you assume becomes what you notice. A fearful mind scans for threat. A grateful mind scans for opportunity. Reality does not change first, attention does, but misunderstanding this principle leads to confusion. Some believe mentalism means wish and receive instantly. Ancient teachings never said that. They said something more demanding. You do not manifest events, you manifest orientation toward events, and that orientation determines everything that follows. A man who believes the world is hostile will interpret silence as rejection, delays as punishment, and setbacks as proof. Another who believes the world is instructive will interpret the same events as guidance. The difference is not external reality, it is the mental architecture behind perception. Hermetic teaching quietly insists on responsibility here. Not blame, responsibility. Because if consciousness participates in reality, then attention is sacred, and what you repeatedly attend to becomes your lived universe. A forgotten fragment from Hermetic tradition states, "As the mind expands, so does the world it perceives." Not because the world changes, but because the frame of awareness does. This is why ancient initiates practiced meditation, symbolic reading, and inner silence. They were not escaping reality. They were refining the instrument through which reality is experienced. So the practical teaching is simple. Watch what your mind repeats when no one is speaking to you. Because that repetition is not background noise. It is construction. Chapter 10. Vibration, the ancient law of movement. In the Kybalion, one of the most widely read Hermetic texts of modern times, there is a principle that appears deceptively simple. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. To the ancient mind, this was not metaphor. It was observation. The priest-scientists of Egypt believed that stillness was only appearance, that beneath every form, stone, breath, thought, there was motion too subtle for ordinary perception. Picture a desert temple at dawn. A priest stands before carved stone walls. To the untrained eye, nothing changes. The temple is fixed, unmoving, eternal. But the priest understands something different. The sand shifts constantly. Heat ripples the air. The mind of the observer changes with each breath. Even stillness is alive with movement. Nothing is truly static, even thought, even identity, even emotion. Ancient Hermetic thinkers did not separate physical and mental reality as modern frameworks often do. To them, thought was not abstract, it was vibrational. Anger was not just an idea. It was a state of energetic movement within consciousness. Calmness was not absence, it was a different rhythm. This is why Marcus Aurelius, writing in the chaos of empire, repeatedly returned to inner stillness. He understood that external events move constantly like waves, but the internal observer can shift its frequency in response. Modern psychology mirrors this idea in different language. Emotional regulation, nervous system states, cognitive framing, all describe the same underlying truth. Internal states are dynamic patterns, not fixed identities, yet the ancients went further. They believed that when your inner state shifts, your perception of reality shifts with it. A traveler once visited a Pythagorean school in southern Italy. He expected mathematical lectures, but instead he was asked to sit in silence for days. When he finally complained, the teacher said, "You are still too loud inside to hear the harmony." "What harmony?" the traveler asked. "The one that is always vibrating beneath all things." This idea, that existence has underlying rhythm, appears across traditions. In Indian philosophy, it is echoed in the concept of spanda, the subtle vibration of consciousness. In Hermeticism, it becomes universal law. Nothing is fixed, everything is becoming. Even your emotional world is not a prison. It is a frequency pattern you unconsciously return to, and patterns can be changed, but not by force, by shift. A person in grief does not need denial. They need gradual change in inner rhythm, attention, breath, thought, direction. A person in fear does not need escape. They need stabilization of awareness until the frequency of panic dissolves into clarity. The ancient insight is subtle. You do not fight vibration. You change it by becoming something else. This is why rituals mattered in ancient cultures. Chanting, repetition, symbolic gestures, they were not superstition. They were tools for shifting internal states through structured rhythm. A repeated sound changes breathing, breath changes emotion, emotion changes perception, and perception becomes lived reality. Even modern life confirms this. Music alters mood instantly. Environments change thought patterns. Relationships adjust internal state more than logic ever does. Everything is already vibrational interaction. You are simply unaware of it most of the time. The Hermetic warning is clear. If everything vibrates, then nothing you feel is permanent. This is both liberating and unsettling, because it means you are not fixed. But neither is your suffering, and neither is your clarity, so the practice becomes awareness of movement itself. What frequency am I in right now? What state do I keep returning to? What inner rhythm defines my outer experience? Ancient teachers said that mastery begins when observation replaces reaction. because once you see the movement, you are no longer only inside it. You begin to influence it. Chapter 11: Emotional Frequency and Human Experience. A Greek physician once wrote that illness begins long before the body fails. It begins in the unseen weather of emotion, not storms in the sky, but storms within, fear that tightens the chest, resentment that hardens memory, hope that quietly rebuilds the future before it arrives. Across ancient Egypt, priests described emotional states as breaths of the soul. In Taoist monasteries, they spoke of emotions as currents in the river of being. Currents that either carried a person toward clarity or pulled them into confusion. None of these traditions treated emotion as random. They saw it as frequency, an invisible vibration shaping perception, behavior, and destiny. Imagine a traveler in the desert, lost between two caravan routes. The heat is the same. The dunes are identical. Yet his internal state determines everything. Fear makes every shadow a threat. Calm reveals hidden tracks in the sand. Nothing outside changes, but everything experienced does. That is emotional frequency. Ancient Stoics understood this with unusual precision. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But thoughts and emotions are inseparable threads. The coloring begins with feeling before logic catches up. A fearful mind does not interpret reality, it distorts it. A grateful mind does not deny hardship, it reorganizes it. A forgotten parable from early desert hermits tells of a monk who lived in isolation for decades. One day a traveler asked him, "How do you survive such loneliness?" The monk replied, "I am never alone. I live in the company of my emotions. I learned to change the company, and so I changed my world." At first glance this sounds mystical, but psychologically it is precise. Emotional states filter attention. Fear narrows perception. Anger accelerates reaction. Gratitude expands awareness. Neuroscience today confirms what ancient observers already knew. Emotional states reshape cognition itself. Consider resentment. It is not merely an emotion, it is a loop. It replays past events, reinforcing neural pathways tied to injury and injustice. Over time it becomes a lens. Through that lens, neutral events appear hostile. Even kindness can be mistrusted. The external world has not changed, but the interpreter has been conditioned. Now consider gratitude. It does not erase difficulty. Instead, it broadens perception. What was once invisible, support, timing, opportunity, becomes visible again. Ancient indigenous teachings often described gratitude as opening the eyes of the spirit. Not metaphorically, literally as a shift in awareness. In a Himalayan story preserved through oral tradition, a young apprentice once complained that meditation had not changed his life. His teacher instructed him to sit beside a river for 3 days and observe only emotion, nothing else. At first, the apprentice saw only boredom, then irritation, then sadness. Finally, something shifted. He realized the emotions were not happening to him. They were passing through him. When he returned, the teacher said, "Now you are ready to see the world." That is emotional mastery, not suppression, but observation without identification. Modern life rarely encourages this awareness. Instead, emotional reactions are amplified, monetized, and recycled. Fear sells urgency. Anger fuels engagement. Anxiety drives consumption. Without awareness, individuals become unconscious participants in their own emotional programming. Ancient wisdom offered a different path, governance of internal weather. The Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, visualizing adversity not to create fear, but to reduce emotional volatility. Taoist sages practiced emotional non-resistance, allowing feelings to rise and fall like clouds without interference. Buddhist teachings emphasized equanimity, not emotional numbness but emotional freedom. Across traditions, a shared truth emerges. Emotional frequency directs energy. A person operating from fear moves defensively. A person operating from clarity moves strategically. A person operating from gratitude moves expansively. Same world, different trajectory. There is a subtle but profound insight hidden here. Emotion does not merely respond to reality, it participates in constructing it. This is why two people can experience the same event and leave with entirely different life directions. One sees failure, another sees instruction. One collapses inward, another adapts. Neither interpretation is purely objective. Both are shaped by internal frequency. This is why ancient initiates trained emotional discipline as seriously as physical skill. In Egyptian temple schools, students were said to undergo purification of feeling before they were taught sacred knowledge. Not because emotions were sinful, but because undisciplined emotion distorts perception. A scattered mind cannot read subtle truth. A turbulent heart cannot perceive hidden order. A stable emotional field becomes a clearer mirror. And here lies a crucial realization. Emotional mastery is not about control. It is about alignment, not forcing emotions away, but understanding their intelligence. Fear often signals perceived risk. Sadness signals release. Anger signals boundary violation. Each carries information, but unexamined they become distortions. A warrior does not silence his senses. He refines them in the same way emotional awareness refines perception. So the question becomes not how do I stop feeling, but what is my emotional state teaching me about how I am interpreting reality? When this question is asked consistently, something shifts. The inner world becomes observable instead of overwhelming. And what is observed begins to lose unconscious control. This is the ancient principle behind emotional alchemy. Transformation begins when feeling is witnessed instead of obeyed, and once witnessed, it becomes editable. That is the hidden threshold most people never cross, because beyond it, emotion is no longer fate. It becomes energy, and energy can be directed. Chapter 12. As above, so below. Ancient Hermetic teachings preserved a principle that appears deceptively simple, yet collapses the boundary between inner life and outer reality. As above, so below. As within, so without. To the untrained mind, it sounds poetic. To the initiated mind, it is structural. It describes correspondence, not metaphor, but reflection. In Egyptian temple philosophy, priests believed the human being was not separate from the cosmos, but a microcosm of it. The stars were not distant objects, they were mirrored principles. The body was not merely physical. It was symbolic architecture reflecting universal order. A student once asked a Hermetic teacher, "If the universe is so vast, how can it reflect within me?" The teacher replied, "A drop of water does not contain the ocean, yet it carries its pattern." This is correspondence, not size, structure, not imitation, reflection. Across Greek philosophy, Plato echoed this idea in his theory of forms, the visible world as an imperfect reflection of deeper realities. What is seen is always secondary to what is structured unseen. Now bring this principle into lived experience. A person with internal chaos often encounters external disorder. Relationships become unstable. Decisions become reactive. Time feels fragmented. Not because the world is punishing them, but because perception filters experience through internal state. Another person with internal coherence experiences the same environment differently. Challenges appear solvable. Patterns become visible. Timing feels aligned. The outer world has not changed, but its interpretation has. This is correspondence in action. Ancient mystics did not treat this as abstract philosophy. They used it as a tool of transformation. In Kabbalistic thought, the inner sephirah, attributes of consciousness, shape the external unfolding of life. In Taoism, harmony within aligns with harmony in nature. In Stoicism, perception governs response, and response governs outcome. Across traditions, one principle repeats: the inner world is not separate from the outer world. It is its organizing root. Consider a simple example from daily life. Two people wake up late for the same appointment. One reacts with panic, frustration, self-criticism. The other accepts the situation, recalibrates, and adjusts calmly. Same event, different internal state, but notice what follows. The first person may rush, make errors, and reinforce stress for the rest of the day. The second may arrive slightly late but composed, able to recover quickly. The external consequences diverge, not because of circumstance, but because of internal alignment, as above, so below, as within, so without. This is not mystical escapism. It is psychological structure. Modern cognitive science mirrors this principle in its own language. Attention, interpretation, and expectation shape perception. What we believe internally primes what we notice externally. The brain does not passively receive reality, it constructs it. Ancient wisdom simply stated this more directly. A story from early Sufi tradition describes a traveler searching for wisdom across distant lands. After years of searching, he meets a silent mystic who tells him only this: "You have traveled far to find what reflects your own heart." The traveler returns home and begins observing not the world, but his reactions to it. Slowly, patterns emerge. The same external situations, once perceived as obstacles, begin to reveal meaning, not because they changed, but because he changed. That is correspondence at work, and here is where the teaching becomes practical. If inner patterns shape outer experience, then transformation does not begin by controlling the world. It begins by refining internal structure. Anger shapes conflict, clarity shapes direction, fear shapes limitation, presence shapes possibility. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes readable. Like a symbolic language, reality begins to reflect internal state with increasing accuracy. Not as punishment or reward, but as feedback. Ancient initiates called this the mirror principle. The world is not separate from consciousness. It is consciousness expressed in form. So when life feels chaotic, the hermetic question is not, "Why is the world like this?" but "What within me is organizing experience this way?" This question changes everything, because it redirects attention from blame to awareness, from reaction to observation, from fragmentation to integration. And over time, something subtle occurs. The inner world becomes less reactive, more coherent. And as coherence increases, external experience begins to stabilize, not through force, but through alignment. That is the hidden movement of correspondence, not control, not domination, coherence. And when understood deeply, it becomes clear: you are not living in reality, you are participating in its structure. Chapter 13. The Hidden Power of Attention. In the old mystery schools of Egypt and Greece, students were taught something that seemed almost too simple to be sacred. Where your attention goes, your life follows, not metaphorically. Practically, attention was treated as a force, not passive observation, but active participation in shaping experience. The ancients believed attention was the bridge between consciousness and reality. What you consistently observe begins to organize itself into meaning, and meaning begins to structure behavior. In the temples of Egypt, initiates underwent long periods of disciplined focus. They would sit in dim chambers, watching a single flame without distraction. Not as punishment, but as training. The purpose was not to worship fire, it was to refine perception itself. To learn that attention, when stabilized, begins to reveal layers of reality normally hidden by mental noise. A young initiate once asked a priest, "Why must we stare at a single flame for so long?" The priest replied, "Because the mind that cannot hold one flame will be scattered in 1,000 directions." This is the hidden danger ancient teachers saw long before psychology gave it language. A fragmented attention creates a fragmented life. Now consider the modern mind. It does not sit in temples. It sits in constant interruption, notifications, headlines, shifting images, endless micro-demands for awareness. Attention is no longer directed, it is extracted, and in this state, something subtle happens. Experience becomes shallow, not because life loses depth, but because attention never stays long enough to perceive it. Ancient wisdom would interpret this as a spiritual consequence, but psychology frames it differently. Attention determines neural reinforcement. What you repeatedly focus on strengthens its presence in your mental landscape. The brain follows attention like water follows gravity. So if attention is scattered, experience becomes scattered. If attention is steady, experience becomes structured. A desert parable tells of a monk who once carried a small mirror everywhere he went. One day, the mirror cracked. Instead of discarding it, he continued using it. A traveler asked him, "Why keep a broken mirror?" The monk replied, "Because it still reflects what I choose to see." The traveler laughed, "But it distorts everything." The monk nodded. "Exactly. And now I must choose what I focus on more carefully." This is the subtle teaching of attention. It does not just reveal reality. It selects which version of reality becomes dominant. If attention lingers on fear, fear becomes amplified. If attention lingers on grievance, grievance becomes identity. If attention lingers on possibility, possibility begins to organize thought, not because external reality instantly changes, but because internal interpretation becomes structured around what is consistently observed. Across traditions, concentration was never just mental discipline, it was transformation practice. Stoics practiced attention through reflection. Buddhist monks trained awareness through breath. Hermetic initiates used symbolic contemplation. Taoist sages observed nature until mind and environment became indistinguishable. Different languages, same discovery. Attention is not neutral, it shapes the perceiver. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the quality of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts, but deeper still, the quality of thoughts depends on where attention rests. A mind anchored in distraction becomes reactive. A mind anchored in observation becomes reflective. A mind anchored in presence becomes creative, because presence is not empty, it is structured awareness without fragmentation. In one hermetic fragment preserved through oral tradition, a teacher tells his student, "Do not seek to change the world first. Learn to see what you are already feeding with your attention." The student asks, "What does attention feed?" The teacher replies, "Whatever it lingers upon." This is the hidden law beneath manifestation teachings, Stoic discipline, and meditative practices. Not mystical wish fulfillment, but energetic reinforcement. Attention is currency, and whatever receives it becomes stronger in experience. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient systems intuited. Attention is not passive, it is selective amplification. What you repeatedly focus on becomes more neurologically accessible. Emotional focus strengthens emotional pathways. Cognitive focus strengthens interpretive frameworks. Over time, attention creates bias. Bias becomes perception. Perception becomes identity. Identity becomes life structure. This is why two people in the same environment can experience entirely different realities. One attends to limitation, the other attends to opportunity. The world is identical, the focus is not. Ancient wisdom did not aim to suppress reality. It aimed to refine attention so reality could be perceived more clearly. Chapter 14, The Kingdom Within. Across countless ancient traditions, Stoic philosophy, Hermetic teachings, early Christian mysticism, and Eastern contemplative paths, there is a shared, almost startling declaration: the most important realm you will ever encounter is not outside you, it is within. This idea appears in different forms. Know thyself, the kingdom is within, the self is the path, but beneath all variations lies a single principle. Transformation does not begin in external circumstances, it begins in inner consciousness. Ancient teachers did not deny external reality. They simply understood that external change without internal change is temporary at best and chaotic at worst. A parable from early philosophical traditions tells of a king who ruled a vast and wealthy land. His armies were strong, his cities prosperous, his influence unquestioned. Yet despite all of this, he was restless. One night he disguised himself and left his palace to walk among ordinary people. He wanted to understand why dissatisfaction still lived inside him. In the marketplace, he met an old sage sitting quietly. The king asked him, "Why do I feel like I have nothing, even though I own everything?" The sage looked at him and said, "Because your kingdom is outside you." The king was confused. "But I am the ruler," the sage replied. "You rule land, not yourself." The king returned to his palace disturbed. Over time, he realized something uncomfortable. His reactions ruled him more than his authority ever did. Anger dictated decisions. Fear shaped alliances. Desire influenced judgment. He was not sovereign within. And without inner sovereignty, outer power meant very little. Ancient Stoics called this inner domain the only true possession. Epictetus taught that everything outside the mind is not truly ours. It can shift, disappear, or resist control, but inner response, interpretation, and awareness, that is the domain of true freedom. Hermetic teachings expand this further. The outer world, they suggest, reflects inner order, not as punishment or reward, but as correspondence. So the kingdom within is not metaphorical comfort. It is structural reality. Your internal state organizes your external experience. Modern psychology would describe this differently: core beliefs, emotional regulation, cognitive schemas. But ancient wisdom simplifies it into something more direct. The inner world is the operating system of experience. If the operating system is unstable, perception becomes fragmented. If it is rigid, experience becomes limited. If it is aware, experience becomes flexible. The kingdom within is not about perfection. It is about awareness of internal processes. Thoughts rise. Emotions shift, memories echo, ports repeat. Most people live inside these movements without noticing them. Ancient teachings suggest the beginning of wisdom is simply seeing them. A story from early contemplative traditions tells of a hermit living on a mountain. One day, a violent storm approached. Travelers rushed to find shelter, fearing destruction. When they reached the hermit's cave, they found him sitting calmly, unmoved. They shouted, "Aren't you afraid of the storm?" The hermit replied, "The storm is outside. I am not." One traveler asked, "But what if it destroys everything?" The hermit answered, "Then it was never mine to begin with." This is not detachment from life. It is recognition of where control actually exists. Ancient teachings consistently return to one idea: external change without internal alignment leads to instability. A person may change jobs, relationships, environments, But if internal patterns remain unchanged, the same experiences reappear in different forms. This is why Stoics emphasized internal governance, why Hermeticists emphasized consciousness, why mystical traditions emphasized inner purification. They were not avoiding reality, they were restructuring its foundation. The kingdom within is not discovered once. It is maintained continuously, every moment. Attention either strengthens inner clarity or internal noise. Every reaction either reinforces awareness or unconscious habit. Every interpretation either aligns with sovereignty or dependence on external conditions. To live in the kingdom within is to observe what thoughts govern your perception, what emotions shape your decisions, what assumptions define your identity, and slowly, deliberately, learning to witness rather than be ruled. This is not escape from life, it is participation with awareness. Chapter 15. The frequency of fear. In the old desert traditions, fear was never treated as weakness. It was treated as distortion, a distortion of sight, of judgment, of time itself. The elders of early contemplative schools believed fear did something subtle but profound. It narrowed the world, not physically, but perceptually, as if reality itself constricted around the frightened mind, offering fewer paths, fewer possibilities, fewer interpretations. To understand this, imagine a traveler crossing an ancient mountain pass. At dawn, the path is wide, the terrain readable, the sky open. But as fog rolls in, everything changes. The same landscape becomes threatening, the same rocks appear like figures, the same wind sounds like warning. Nothing in the environment has changed. Only perception has collapsed. This is how ancient teachers described fear, not as an emotion alone, but as a contraction of awareness. Stoic philosophers observed this with striking clarity. Epictetus taught that it is not events that disturb people, but interpretations of events. Fear arises when interpretation becomes fixed on worst-case meaning. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that the mind, when disturbed, loses its ability to see clearly, and in that loss of clarity, even neutral events become threatening. Modern psychology confirms this. Fear activates survival circuits that prioritize immediate threat detection over expansive reasoning. Attention becomes tunnel-like. Memory becomes selective. Future projection becomes catastrophic. The ancients, without neuroscience, already understood the experience. Fear does not just react to reality, it reshapes it. A story from early temple traditions tells of a guard stationed in a watchtower overlooking a peaceful valley. One night he believed he saw movement in the distance. His fear intensified. Soon, every shadow became an approaching enemy. He sounded the alarm. The village prepared for war, but when dawn arrived, they discovered nothing had approached. The enemy was mist shifting over fields. The villagers asked him, "Why did you see war where there was none?" The guard replied, "Because I was already afraid." This is the essence of fear frequency. It projects internal state outward and then interprets the projection as reality. Across cultures, ancient teachings consistently warned against collective panic. Not because danger does not exist, but because panic distorts response. In Taoist philosophy, it was said that water becomes dangerous not when it moves, but when it loses stillness within motion. In Stoicism, panic was seen as surrendering rational faculty to impulse. In Egyptian mystery teachings, fear was described as the clouding of the inner eye. All traditions converge on a single understanding. Fear reduces the field of perception, and when perception shrinks, possibility disappears. Fear operates through contraction of breath, attention, and imagination. The body tightens, thoughts accelerate but narrow. Options seem fewer, Decisions feel urgent but limited. A modern person experiencing fear often believes they are seeing more danger. In reality, they are seeing less of reality. This is the paradox the ancients pointed toward. Fear does not expand awareness of threat. It collapses awareness into it, and what awareness collapses into, it begins to reinforce. This is why prolonged fear becomes a self-sustaining loop. The mind repeatedly confirms what it already expects. The world appears to validate internal tension simply because attention filters everything through it. Ancient traditions did not define courage as absence of fear. They defined it as presence of awareness within fear. A Roman soldier trained not to eliminate fear, but to act without surrendering perception to it. A Buddhist practitioner learned to observe fear as sensation, not identity. A desert mystic learned to sit within fear without letting it define reality. Courage, then, is not force. It is clarity under pressure. It is the ability to see beyond contraction. A parable from early philosophical traditions tells of an archer who refused to shoot in windy conditions. When asked why, he said, "The wind changes my aim." An elder observed him and replied, "Then you are not an archer, you are a reaction to wind." The lesson was not about skill. It was about internal stability. Fear is like wind, it moves perception. But mastery is not achieved by eliminating wind. It is achieved by stabilizing attention within it. At its deepest level, fear does something even more profound than distorting perception. It removes imagined futures. When fear dominates, the mind stops generating creative alternatives. It begins to cycle between avoidance and worst-case projection. The imaginative faculty, which ancient traditions considered sacred, becomes constrained. This is why Hermetic teachings emphasize awareness, because awareness restores range. Where fear shrinks possibility, awareness expands it. The ancient practice is simple. Notice fear without immediate interpretation. Observe bodily sensations without narrative attachment. Pause before acting from contraction. This pause is where clarity returns. Not by removing fear, but by refusing to let it become the entire field of perception. Over time, this creates a subtle shift. Fear still arises, but it no longer defines reality. It becomes one signal among many, not the entire map. Fear does not show you more of reality. It removes what you can see. Chapter 16. The Secret of Alignment. In the hidden teachings of Hermetic and Stoic philosophy, there is a principle that appears simple but reveals itself only through lived experience. Power does not come from intensity, it comes from alignment. Alignment is the rare condition in which thought, emotion, and action point in the same direction. When these three inner forces are unified, human experience becomes coherent. When they conflict, life comes fragmented, no matter how much effort is applied. Ancient initiates called this coherence inner harmony. Modern psychology might call it integration, but the experience is the same, a sense that nothing within you is pulling against itself. Imagine a traveler who wishes to reach a distant city. He thinks about moving forward but feels doubt. He acts in one direction but emotionally resists it. His thoughts pull him forward, his emotions pull him back, and his actions become inconsistent. He moves, but slowly, painfully, inefficiently. Ancient teachers would say, he is not moving through the world. He is moving against himself. This internal contradiction was seen as the root of suffering, not external obstacles, but internal fragmentation. Stoics warned that a divided mind cannot act with clarity. Hermetic teachings suggested that incoherence in consciousness produces incoherence in experience. Even Eastern traditions described suffering as arising from internal conflict between desire, fear, and awareness. Across all systems, one principle repeats. Disalignment creates friction. A story from early mystery schools tells of a student who trained for years but failed to produce meaningful results in his life. He studied philosophy, practiced rituals, meditated daily, but nothing changed externally. Frustrated, he asked his teacher, "Why does nothing work?" The teacher asked him to describe his daily intention. The student said, "I want peace. I want success. I want clarity." The teacher nodded. "And what do you feel?" The student paused. "Anxiety, doubt, restlessness." "And what do you do?" the teacher asked. "I act based on urgency." The teacher smiled gently. "Then you are three different people." The lesson was clear. Intention alone is not enough. Alignment is required. Modern psychology recognizes what ancient teachings observed intuitively. Human behavior is governed by multiple competing systems: cognitive belief, emotional response, and behavioral habit. When these systems align, behavior becomes efficient and stable. When they conflict, energy is wasted in internal negotiation. A person may believe they want change, feel fear about change, and continue habitual behavior that prevents change. This creates stagnation, not because of lack of willpower, but because of internal contradiction. Ancient wisdom simply framed this more directly. A divided self cannot manifest clarity. In Hermetic thought, integrity is not moral judgment, it is structural alignment. It means no part of the self is actively contradicting another part. When thought, emotion, and action agree, energy flows without resistance. Decisions become simpler, focus becomes sharper, life begins to feel responsive rather than resistant. This is why ancient teachings repeatedly emphasized truth, not as external honesty alone, but internal consistency. To be aligned is to reduce internal friction. To reduce friction is to increase force efficiency, returning to the metaphor of the archer. Alignment is not about pulling harder on the bow. It is about ensuring the body, breath, aim, and release are unified. If the hand aims forward but the body leans back, the arrow will not fly true. If emotion fears the outcome but thought insists on it, movement becomes unstable. If action contradicts intention, results scatter. Malland is precision of being. Mystery schools often trained alignment through ritual repetition, not as superstition, but as synchronization. Thought was directed through intention. Emotion was stabilized through breath. Action was simplified through discipline. Over time, internal systems began to move in harmony. Stoic practice achieved the same result through reflection and self-observation. Taoist practice through natural attunement. Yogic traditions through breath and focus. Different methods, same outcome. Coherence of being. When alignment occurs, something subtle but powerful happens. Resistance decreases, not because external reality changes, but because internal contradiction dissolves. Energy that was previously consumed by internal conflict becomes available for action. Decisions feel natural rather than forced. Progress feels continuous rather than fragmented. This is why ancient texts often described aligned individuals as flowing with life rather than struggling against it. Flow is not mystical, it is coherence in motion. When nothing within you resists your direction, life stops resisting your movement. Chapter 17. Becoming a conscious creator. In the oldest Hermetic teachings, preserved in fragments across Egypt, Greece, and later Renaissance manuscripts, there is a recurring idea that unsettles the passive mind. Human beings are not merely observers of existence, they are participants in it, not in the modern sense of self-help optimism, but in a far more precise and demanding sense. Consciousness is never neutral. It either participates blindly or it participates consciously. The difference between the two defines the entire structure of a life. Ancient mystery schools often described humanity as existing in two conditions. The first is sleepwalking. Not physical sleep, but perceptual sleep. In this state, a person reacts to life as if it is happening to them. Events appear external, separate, random. The self is a victim of circumstance, luck, or fate. The second condition is awareness, where a person begins to see that their inner state is not separate from their experience of the outer world. Stoic philosophers approached this through discipline of perception. Marcus Aurelius wrote that life is what your thoughts make of it. Hermetic teachings went further, suggesting that life is shaped through participation in consciousness itself. A forgotten Egyptian parable tells of two scribes sitting in the same temple. One writes history as if recording events imposed upon the world. The other writes as if every event is part of a dialogue between mind and reality. When asked which is correct, the teacher says, both are writing. Only one is awake while writing. To become a conscious creator is not to gain control over everything. It is to assume responsibility for inner participation. Responsibility here does not mean blame. Ancient teachings were careful about this distinction. Blame collapses awareness into guilt. Responsibility expands awareness into clarity. A person in blame says, life is happening against me. A person in awareness says, I am participating in how life is experienced. This shift is subtle but foundational. It moves consciousness from reaction to observation, from helplessness to engagement. In Stoic tradition, this was the boundary between suffering and freedom, not control of external events, but mastery of internal response. Epictetus taught that what disturbs us is not events, but our interpretation of them. Hermetic philosophy agrees, but adds something deeper. Interpretation itself becomes creative participation. Mystery schools trained initiates not through accumulation of knowledge, but through sustained awareness practices. One such practice was simple but relentless. Observe your thoughts before reacting. Another, notice emotional impulses before acting on them. Another, trace the pattern between internal state and external outcome. Over time, initiates began to see something remarkable. Their external life was not random. It reflected consistent internal patterns, not punishment, not reward fashion. A young initiate once asked a temple guide, "Why does my life repeat the same struggles?" The guide replied, "Because you repeat the same participation." This is the hidden mechanism of conscious creation. Repetition of inner states produces repetition of external experiences. Modern psychology echoes this through habit loops, cognitive biases, and emotional conditioning. But ancient teachings framed it more directly. Consciousness participates in shaping its field of experience through sustained attention and response. Intentional living, in Hermetic understanding, is not about controlling every outcome. It is about choosing the quality of participation. Two individuals may experience the same external event. One participates unconsciously, reacting from fear, habit, or inherited belief. The other participates consciously, observing, choosing response, aligning action with awareness. The external world remains the same. The lived reality does not. This is why ancient philosophers emphasize self-governance above external ambition. Without inner clarity, external success amplifies internal confusion. A Roman story describes a general who conquered vast territories but could not govern his own anger. His empire expanded while his inner world collapsed. Stoic observers noted that he ruled cities but not himself. Ancient wisdom would say, he participated in conquest but not in consciousness. Conscious creation begins at the exact point where reaction is interrupted. Between stimulus and response lies awareness. That space is where participation becomes conscious. Without that space, life unfolds as conditioned reflex. With that space, life becomes intentional engagement. Hermetic texts often refer to this as awakening, not to a new world, but to a new mode of participation within the same world. And once awareness enters that space, something subtle changes. Patterns begin to loosen. Fear loses automatic authority. Habit loses inevitability. Reaction becomes optional. This is the beginning of creative consciousness. A Taoist-inspired parable tells of a pot filled with muddy water. The water is constantly stirred, making everything unclear. Student asks the master how to clear it. The master says nothing. He simply places the pot down and leaves it untouched. After time, the sediment settles. The water becomes clear on its own. The student asks, "What did you do?" The master replies, "I stopped participating in disturbance." This is conscious creation at its simplest level. Not forcing clarity, but removing unconscious interference. Chapter 18, The Ultimate Law of Energy, Vibration, and Frequency. Across all ancient traditions, Hermeticism, Stoicism, Egyptian mystery teachings, Platonic philosophy, Jungian psychology, and indigenous wisdom, there is a convergence that transcends culture and time. They all point to a single unified insight. Reality is not static matter, it is dynamic consciousness in motion. Different languages describe it differently. Hermeticism calls it vibration. Plato calls it forms reflected in matter. Stoics describe perception shaping experience. Jung speaks of archetypal patterns emerging from the unconscious. Indigenous traditions describe interconnection between all living systems. But beneath all expressions lies one principle. Reality responds to participation. Hermetic philosophy teaches that the all is mind. Stoicism refines this into perception shaping reality. Egyptian mystery schools encode it in symbolic transformation rituals. Plato frames it as visible reflection of invisible truth. Jung describes it as the collective unconscious shaping meaningful coincidences. Native wisdom adds another layer. Nothing exists in isolation. Every thought, action, and intention influences the broader web of existence. These are not separate ideas. They are different angles of the same structure. Consciousness is not inside reality. Reality is inside consciousness. Ancient teachings did not view energy as purely physical. Energy was understood as expression, movement of awareness through form. Emotion was energy in motion, thought was structured energy. Attention was directional energy. When these align, coherence emerges. When they fragment, distortion emerges. This is why Hermetic traditions placed such emphasis on internal harmony. Not moral perfection, but energetic coherence. A person in fear emits fragmented perception. A person in clarity emits structured awareness. A person in alignment experiences reality as responsive rather than resistant. Not because the world changes instantly, but because perception reorganizes experience. Plato's allegory of the cave describes individuals mistaking shadows for reality. But the deeper teaching is not just about illusion, it is about perception as participation. The shadows are not false in existence. They are false in interpretation. What we call reality is filtered through consciousness before it becomes experience. Thus, freeing oneself from illusion is not escaping the world. It is refining the perceiver. Carl Jung observed that meaningful coincidences, synchronicities, appear when inner psychological states align with external events in symbolic resonance. He suggested that psyche and matter are not separate but interconnected expressions of a deeper order. Ancient Hermeticists would agree, what is within resonates outward, not as magical causation, but as pattern coherence. Repeated inner focus organizes perception, which influences action, which shapes outcome, which reinforces inner belief, a closed loop of consciousness and experience. Ancient Egyptian teachings often depicted humans as co-participants in cosmic order, Ma'at, not passive observers but active maintainers of balance. When internal disorder increases, perception of external chaos increases. When internal harmony stabilizes, perception of external coherence returns. This was not symbolic morality, it was experiential observation. Across all systems emerges a unifying principle, often expressed in modern language as frequency. Frequency is not mystical abstraction. It is the quality of sustained inner state. Fear has frequency. Gratitude has frequency. Clarity has frequency. Confusion has frequency, and whatever frequency is sustained becomes the lens through which reality is experienced. Not because reality changes externally, but because perception organizes differently. Indigenous wisdom describes the universe as relational, alive, responsive, interconnected. Nothing exists in isolation. Every action has ripple effects across visible and invisible layers of existence. Hermeticism echoes this through correspondence, Stoicism through responsibility, Jung through synchronicity, Plato through reflection. All converge into a single realization. You are not in a passive universe. You are in a responsive one. To understand this intellectually is not enough. Ancient traditions consistently warned that knowledge without embodiment is incomplete. Thus, the final teaching is practice. Observe your internal state continuously. Notice how perception shifts with emotional tone. Track how repeated thought patterns influence experience. Align attention, emotion, and action consciously. This is not control over reality. It is coherence with it. When all teachings are unified, the message becomes simple. Reality is not something you observe from a distance. It is something you participate in through consciousness itself. And what you repeatedly participate in becomes your lived world. Reality does not respond to wishes. It responds to participation. Conclusion: the return to what was never lost. Across all ancient traditions, from the hidden corridors of Hermetic temples to the silent discipline of Stoic philosophy, from Egyptian mystery schools to Platonic dialogues and indigenous understandings of life, a single thread has been weaving itself through every teaching. It is not a new idea. It is not a secret waiting to be discovered. It is a recognition waiting to be remembered. That recognition is this: you have never been separate from the reality you experience, not in a literal sense of control or manipulation, but in the deeper sense of participation. Consciousness is not a passive mirror of life. It is the medium through which life becomes experience at all. And once this is seen clearly, something fundamental begins to shift, not in the world, but in the way the world is met from within. Most people move through life believing there is a clear boundary between me and what happens to me, between observer and observed, between internal world and external reality. Ancient teachings consistently challenge this separation. Hermes Trismegistus spoke of correspondence, as within, so without. Plato described a reality where what is seen is only a reflection of deeper forms. Stoics taught that perception determines experience. Jung suggested that inner psychological patterns find expression in outer synchronicity. Indigenous wisdom emphasizes relational existence, everything affecting everything else, different languages. Same direction, the separation was always functional, not absolute. It helps us navigate life. but it misleads us into believing we are disconnected from the very field we are shaping through awareness, attention, and interpretation. When this illusion of separation weakens, responsibility transforms. Not responsibility as burden, but responsibility as recognition. Life is no longer something happening to a distant self. It becomes something unfolding through awareness itself. Every tradition, no matter how symbolic or mystical, eventually returns to one practice. Awareness, not belief, not ideology, not accumulation of knowledge. Awareness, because awareness is the one constant beneath shifting thought, emotion, identity, and circumstance. In moments of clarity, you can see this directly. Thoughts arise, but you are not identical to them. Emotions move through, but they are not fixed states. External events appear, but they are interpreted through internal lenses, and beneath all of it, something remains unchanged. The ability to notice. That noticing is the foundation of all transformation. Ancient teachings often called this waking up, not because reality was false, but because unconscious participation creates distortion. When awareness is absent, life is inherited. When awareness is present, life becomes seen. One of the most overlooked truths in all wisdom traditions is that external transformation is slow, but internal recognition is immediate. A person can spend years trying to change circumstances while remaining internally unchanged, and yet, in a single moment of deep awareness, they can see the pattern that has been repeating for years. That moment does not instantly fix to life, but it changed the relationship to life, and that change is the beginning of everything, because what repeats externally is often anchored internally, not as punishment, not as fate, but as pattern, and patterns dissolve when they are seen clearly. A story preserved in variations across many traditions speaks of a traveler who spent his entire life searching for truth in distant lands. He studied with masters, crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and collected teachings from every corner of the world. In the end, exhausted, he returned home without answers. As he sat in silence in his own room, something unusual happened. He noticed the way his thoughts had been shaping his journey all along. The urgency, the expectation, the belief that truth was always somewhere else. And in that quiet recognition, the traveler realized something unexpected. He had been walking through truth the entire time, but interpreting it as distance. Nothing had to be added, only seen differently. Across Stoic, Hermetic, and contemplative teachings, there is a repeated emphasis on alignment, not as perfection but as coherence. When thought, emotion, and action move in different directions, life feels fragmented. When they begin to align, even imperfectly, something stabilizes. This stability is not external control. It is internal integrity, and integrity changes perception, because perception is not passive. It is structured by internal state. This is why two people can live in the same environment and experience entirely different realities. One sees limitation, the other sees possibility. One sees delay, the other sees timing. One sees obstacle, the other sees instruction. The world does not change first. The interpretation does. And interpretation is shaped by consciousness. At a certain point in the journey, the search itself becomes unnecessary, not because truth is found as an object, but because the search dissolves into awareness. This is where ancient teachings converge again. The Hermetic student realizes the mind is not separate from reality. The Stoic recognizes that suffering arises from judgment, not events. The mystic understands that separation was always perceived, not real. The philosopher sees that meaning is not discovered externally but formed internally, and all of them arrive at a quiet conclusion. There is nowhere else to go, only deeper seeing. What remains after all concepts, systems and interpretations settle is simple, lived awareness. You still think, you still feel, you still act, but something subtle changes. You begin to notice participation as it happens. This noticing becomes the center, and from that center, reaction slows, clarity increases, and life becomes less of a struggle against conditions and more of a dialogue with them. Ancient teachings did not promise escape from life. They pointed toward a different way of being within it, not control, not detachment, but conscious participation. If there is a single thread that connects all teachings in this entire journey, it is this: you are not separate from the field you experience. You are the awareness through which it is known, and what you repeatedly bring into awareness shapes the quality of that experience. This is not mysticism as escape, it is responsibility as clarity, it is not fantasy, it is structure. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The ancients did not leave wisdom as something to worship. They left it as something to live, to observe attention, to refine perception, to notice repetition, to recognize patterns, to align thought, emotion, and action, to become aware of awareness itself, not as philosophy, but as practice. And in that practice, something quietly reveals itself. Nothing was ever missing, only unnoticed. The journey was never about becoming something else. It was about seeing what has always been here. And once seen clearly, everything begins to reorganize around awareness. Not because reality changes first, but because you do. And in that recognition, the search ends where it always was, within awareness itself.